Now, if you're like me and have been following politics over the last 10 years, you'll have been in despair at the leadership churn, at the coup culture that we've seen, the revolving door of prime ministers. And this has got me thinking a lot about Australia's anti-leadership culture. And I was prompted this week watching Scott Morrison give what I thought was a very good interview with Lee Sales on the ABC on Monday night of this week. Now, Morrison's been under a lot of pressure over the summer. Things went badly wrong for him when he legitimately decided to have a holiday at the end of the year with his young family, his 2 young girls and his wife Jenny in Hawaii. Nothing wrong with that at all. I guess regrettably for Morrison is that the bushfire crisis escalated, and a lot of pressure developed on Morrison to come home. And his office had not disclosed that he'd gone on holidays nor where he'd gone to. Perhaps they should have. But nonetheless, he came in for a lot of what I consider to be very unfair criticism. And the left and those in the media who hate what the conservative side of politics stands for, they saw this as their opportunity to try and tear down Morrison and to tear down his leadership. They are angry that the Australian people didn't vote for Bill Shorten. A coronation of Bill Shorten and the Labor Party was expected by all the pundits at the May 18 election. Of course, that didn't happen. So they saw their opportunity over summer with some vulnerabilities and some cracks appearing to really have a red-hot go at Morrison. And it really did, I think, throw him off his mojo a little bit. But he's quickly recovered and he's got himself back on the front foot, and we've seen that with the government's response to the coronavirus. But this brings us back to the Lee Sales interview on Monday night. And it got me thinking, because I really think that Scott Morrison has the opportunity to be a Prime Minister for this nation for the long term, in the way that Bob Hawke was, in the way that John Howard, who I think was our greatest modern Prime Minister, was able to achieve by longevity. And if Morrison can right the ship, which I believe he's doing, I think that he can really set himself up for that. And we saw glimpses of his ability to stare down the vitriol of the left and their unfair accusations as he was confronted by Lee Sales on Monday night. Now, she put to him a range of propositions, chief of which was that the government is not doing enough on climate change, that the government doesn't have an economic narrative. All this is untrue. And Morrison, I think, very skillfully batted this away. He said, well, he didn't agree with Lee Sales. He was quite forceful in pushing back. He said the government does have an economic agenda. It's rolled out a massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure program. That's all been announced in the budget. That's rolling out now. We've seen big tax cuts. And these are things that we're going to see roll through the economy, in spite of the risks to the economy, of course, of the bushfires and the coronavirus outbreak. But Sales also pushed Morrison on what the left sees as its great moral cause, and that is the issue of climate change, and this narrative that the left run over and over and over again, almost on a loop on the ABC and other media, that the government is not doing anything on climate change, that we are lagging behind the world. And of course, Morrison pushed back on that and repeated what he's been saying, and that is that Australia will meet and beat its Paris commitments, which is to reduce carbon emissions by get them down to 26% by 2030. Now, these are ambitious targets. We're one of the few countries in the world who'll actually do this. But of course, since then, Anthony Albanese has said that he's going to get Australia to net zero emissions by 2050. No plan, no costings, but he said that's what Australia is going to aim for. Now, Lee Sales pushed Morrison on this and said, well, even the Conservative government of Boris Johnson in the UK has a net zero policy by 2050. Now, Morrison very cleverly pushed back yet again with information that we don't often hear in the media. And this is the fact that it's one thing for the UK to be well advanced with renewable energy technologies such as wind and solar, principally wind, and it has a lot of that capacity. But of course, what we don't hear, and Morrison said this, is that the UK has an extension cord, to use Morrison's word, that goes underneath the English Channel and connects up with nuclear power stations in France. That is how the UK is able to have such a lot of wind generation in its electricity system. Now, Australia doesn't have nuclear. Our political class will not allow it. The Greens and Labor are dead against it. There's a few brave souls in the coalition who are starting to make the case for it. But if we were serious about reducing emissions, we would have to look at the nuclear option in Australia. But instead, coal is being demonised. We have been closing down coal-fired power stations at a great rate of knots, to the point where our electricity grid is now unstable, it's unreliable, and our electricity prices have gone from being some of the lowest in the OECD to amongst the highest in the OECD for no benefit. And of course, consumers, battlers are paying through high electricity bills. So for Morrison to call out the left as it holds up the UK and a Conservative government there as the paragon of virtue when it comes to renewable energy and low emissions and this 2050 net zero target, Morrison was right to say, well, hang on, you can do that if you've got a connector to nuclear power. What Australians don't realise, and those who are clamouring for more climate change action, is that wind and solar cannot power a modern economy. If we want to have jobs here, if we want to have reliable electricity, if we want to have affordable electricity. And that's why we need coal. That's why the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, is begging AGL to keep the giant power station in the Hunter Valley, the Liddell power station, open so that we don't lose reliability of supply into New South Wales and Victoria. So we need to see more of this from Morrison, more of this pushback on the left, more of the case being made publicly that counters the half-truths and the downright lies about the ability of the economy to transition, so that people know the facts when they're voting. Now, Morrison showed steel on Monday night. We saw him show this steel when he was Immigration Minister and stared down the left's assault on the decency of mainstream Australians because we wanted to have secure borders, because we wanted to stop people drowning at sea at the hands of merciless people smugglers. And Morrison stared that down as Immigration Minister and he stopped the boats. It's that sort of steel that we saw again on Monday night as ScoMo found his mojo. If he can find more of that and stare down the left, I think he can set himself up to be a long-term Prime Minister. That's what our nation needs. We need stability, and we need the arguments to be being made in the public square over and over and again to counter the one-way communication that's coming from the left, which is half-truths and often downright lies. So this is auguring well, and I think we should watch with great interest Morrison's progress, and that he will find greater resolve to keep prosecuting these arguments in the public square.